My name is Meredith Callahan, and I am 34 years old. I sat in my corner office on the 47th floor overlooking downtown Chicago when my phone buzzed with a text from my younger brother Derek. The message read simply, "Don't come to the BBQ. Trust me." Before I could even process those words, my office door swung wide open. Derek and his wife Tiffany stood there, their faces pale as ghosts. Tiffany clutched a stack of documents in her trembling hands. Derek whispered urgently, "Meredith, they are trying to destroy you. We made a terrible mistake." Behind them, I spotted two police officers approaching my office door. Everything I had spent my entire life building was about to crumble around me. Before I continue this story, I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, revenge, and ultimate justice, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Trust me, you do not want to miss what happens when I discovered that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had been plotting my destruction for years. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. 6 months before that terrifying moment in my office, my life looked perfect from the outside. I was a partner-track attorney at Morrison & Hartley Law Firm, one of the most prestigious firms in Chicago. I specialized in estate law and inheritance disputes, which meant I spent my days helping families navigate the complicated process of distributing wealth after loved ones passed away. The irony of my specialty would become painfully clear soon enough. I worked 70 hours every single week, sometimes more during difficult cases. I had sacrificed my personal life entirely for my career. No husband, no children, no time for dating or hobbies or anything that normal 34-year-old women enjoyed. My luxury apartment on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise was beautiful, but empty. I had financial independence, professional respect, and absolutely no one to share it with except my family, and even that relationship was complicated beyond words. My mother Brenda had always favored my younger brother Derek. He was her miracle baby, born when she was 33 years old after years of believing she could not have another child. I was the accident, the unexpected pregnancy that happened when Brenda was only 23, and still pursuing her dreams of becoming a model. She never let me forget that my existence had destroyed her career before it even started. Growing up, I heard countless stories about the agencies that had been interested in her, the photo shoots she had scheduled, the future that was stolen from her the moment she discovered she was pregnant with me. Derek, on the other hand, was planned, wanted, celebrated. He received praise for average grades, while my straight-A report cards were met with indifference. He received new cars while I worked 3 jobs to buy my first vehicle. When it came time for college, I paid my own way through scholarships and student loans, while I also helped pay for Derek's tuition, because our parents said they could not afford it. I bought him his first car after graduation. I contributed to his wedding fund. I did everything a devoted older sister should do, hoping that eventually my family would see my value. My father Harold was a quiet man who had long ago surrendered control of our family to Brenda. He was 65 years old, and had spent over 4 decades letting his wife make every decision, including how to treat his firstborn daughter. He never defended me when Brenda criticized my weight, my appearance, my choices, my career. He simply looked away and pretended not to hear. Family gatherings were torture for me, but I attended every single one out of a sense of duty and a desperate hope that things would change. I kept believing that if I just tried hard enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, my mother would finally look at me with the love and pride she reserved for Derek. That belief kept me trapped in a cycle of abuse that I could not even recognize as abuse until it was almost too late. The only person in my family who truly loved me was my grandmother Edith. She was 88 years old, and sharp as a tack, despite her age. Grandmother Edith had built a real estate empire from nothing, starting with a single duplex she purchased in 1962, and growing it into a portfolio worth approximately $12 million. She was a self-made woman in an era when that was nearly impossible, and she had always seen something of herself in me. Every Sunday without fail, I drove 45 minutes to her estate in the suburbs to spend the afternoon with her. We would drink tea, discuss business, and share the kind of honest conversation I could never have with anyone else in my family. I helped her manage her affairs, reviewed contracts, and made sure no one was taking advantage of her. Brenda and Derek rarely visited Grandmother Edith except when they needed money, which was frequently. Derek had borrowed over $80,000 from her over the years for various failed business ventures, none of which he ever repaid. Yet Grandmother Edith kept giving because that was her nature, generous to a fault with everyone she loved. One Sunday afternoon, About 6 months before everything exploded, Grandmother Edith took my hand and told me something that would change everything. She said she was planning to leave me the majority of her estate when she passed. She explained that I was the only one who had ever truly cared for her, not for her money, but for her as a person. I tried to refuse, tried to tell her that was not necessary, but she insisted. She said Derek had received enough handouts and Brenda had never once visited without asking for something in return. She wanted her legacy to go to someone who would honor it, and that person was me. I had no idea that this act of love from my grandmother would paint a target on my back, that my own mother would aim at with deadly precision. My Aunt Lorraine, who was Brenda's younger sister by 4 years, had always positioned herself as my ally in the family. She was 58 years old, and called me at least once a week to check in. She would say things like, "I know Brenda is hard on you and I wish I could make her see how wonderful you are." I trusted her completely. I shared my feelings, my frustrations, my hopes and fears with her because I believed she genuinely cared about me. I had no idea that every word I spoke to Lorraine was being reported directly back to my mother. I had no idea that the woman I thought was my confidant was actually a spy, paid handsomely to keep tabs on the daughter Brenda wanted to destroy. 5 months before the confrontation in my office, Grandmother Edith received devastating news. Her doctors diagnosed her with terminal pancreatic cancer and gave her between 6 and 8 months to live. When she called to tell me, I drove to her house immediately and held her while we both cried. Despite her diagnosis, Grandmother Edith was remarkably composed. She had lived a full life, she said, and she had few regrets. But she had one piece of unfinished business that she needed to address immediately, and that was her will. She asked me to help her update her estate documents, but I knew better than to involve myself directly in something that could create a conflict of interest. Instead, I recommended a colleague from another firm, a man named Theodore Prescott who specialized in estate planning. He came to Grandmother Edith's home and spent 3 full days documenting her wishes with meticulous care. When the will was finalized, Grandmother Edith shared the details with me, even though she probably should not have. She left 70% of her estate to me, which amounted to approximately $8 million. Derek would receive 20%, roughly $2.4 million, which was more than generous considering he had never repaid a single dollar of what he had borrowed over the years. Brenda would receive 10% plus the family home where she and Harold currently lived. Grandmother Edith explained her reasoning clearly and without apology. She said I was the only one who had ever treated her like a person rather than a bank account. She made me promise to keep the contents of the will secret until after her death, because she knew exactly how Brenda would react if she found out. I gave her my word, but keeping that secret would prove far more difficult than I ever imagined. About a week after the will was finalized, I made a terrible mistake. During one of my weekly phone calls with Aunt Lorraine, I mentioned that Grandmother Edith had updated her estate documents. I did not reveal any specifics about the distribution, but I foolishly said something like, "Grandma is being very generous to me." I thought I was sharing good news with someone who cared about my happiness. Instead, I was handing a weapon to my enemy. Lorraine called Brenda within minutes of hanging up with me, and from that moment forward, my mother became obsessed with discovering exactly what was in that will. She needed to know how much she stood to lose, and how much I stood to gain, and she was willing to do anything to find out. Brenda's initial scheme was almost laughable in its transparency. After years of barely visiting Grandmother Edith, she suddenly started showing up at her house 3 or 4 times a week. She brought Derek and his wife Tiffany along to bond with their grandmother, as if decades of neglect could be erased with a few awkward afternoon visits. Brenda would sit beside Grandmother Edith's bed and hold her hand, telling her how much she loved her, and how grateful she was for everything she had done for the family. She hinted strongly that she hoped Grandmother Edith would reconsider her estate plans to ensure the inheritance was distributed fairly among all family members. Grandmother Edith saw through these manipulations immediately, but was too wise to let on. She smiled and nodded and thanked Brenda for visiting while shooting me knowing looks whenever her daughter turned away. One afternoon when we were alone, Grandmother Edith grabbed my hand with surprising strength and warned me. She said they were circling like vultures and I needed to be prepared for what was coming. I thought I understood what she meant. I had no idea how bad things were about to get. Tiffany proved to be the most dangerous player in Brenda's game. She was 28 years old and had married Derek just 3 years earlier, after a whirlwind romance that now seemed suspiciously calculated. She volunteered enthusiastically to help with Grandmother Edith's care, offering to organize medications, prepare meals, and assist with daily tasks. In reality, She was using every opportunity to search through Grandmother Edith's private documents. She went through filing cabinets, desk drawers, and storage boxes looking for anything related to the estate. She found what she was looking for about 3 weeks into her charade. Hidden in a folder marked household receipts, Tiffany discovered a draft of the new will. She photographed every single page and sent the images directly to Brenda. The message she included was brief and explosive. Meredith gets almost everything. From that moment forward, my mother's casual scheming transformed into a coordinated campaign to destroy me completely. 3 months before the confrontation in my office, I received a phone call that shocked me to my core. My mother Brenda was on the other end of the line, and for the first time in recent memory, she was calling me directly rather than communicating through Derek or leaving passive-aggressive voicemails. Her voice was warm, almost tender, as she invited me to a family gathering she was organizing. She called it a reconciliation BBQ, and said she had been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship. She told me she knew she had not been the best mother to me over the years, and that she wanted to make things right before it was too late. She mentioned Grandmother Edith's illness, and said it had made her realize how important family truly was. She wanted us to start fresh, to put the past behind us, and build something better. I was so stunned that I could barely respond. After 34 years of criticism, neglect, and emotional abuse, my mother was finally reaching out to me with love. At least that was what I desperately wanted to believe. In the weeks leading up to the BBQ, Aunt Lorraine called me even more frequently than usual. She was effusive in her encouragement, telling me how proud she was of Brenda for finally coming around. She said my mother had been talking about me constantly, sharing memories of my childhood and expressing regret for the distance between us. Lorraine convinced me that this reconciliation was genuine, that Brenda had truly changed, and that I would be a fool to miss this opportunity to heal our relationship. I wanted so badly to believe her that I ignored every warning sign. My best friend and colleague Corinne Mitchell tried to talk sense into me. She was 35 years old and had been my closest friend since law school. She worked as a paralegal at Morrison and Hartley, which meant she saw me every day and knew my family situation better than anyone outside the family itself. When I told her about the BBQ invitation, she looked at me with deep concern and said it seemed too good to be true. She reminded me of every cruel thing Brenda had ever done, and asked why my mother would suddenly change after all these years. I dismissed her concerns because I did not want to hear them. I convinced myself that Corinne was being overprotective, and that this time would be different. I prepared for that BBQ with the enthusiasm of a child preparing for Christmas morning. I bought expensive gifts for everyone: a designer handbag for Brenda, golf clubs for Harold, a smartwatch for Derek, jewelry for Tiffany. I spent over $3,000 on presents for people who were planning to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. I got my hair professionally styled and bought a new summer dress that cost more than my first car. I wanted to look perfect. I wanted my family to see me and finally be proud of who I had become. The night before the BBQ, I barely slept. I lay awake imagining conversations where my mother told me she loved me, where my father hugged me and said he was sorry for all the years of silence, where Derek admitted that I had always been there for him, and he was grateful. These fantasies kept me company through the long night, sweet dreams that would turn into nightmares the following afternoon. I arrived at my parents' house exactly on time, arms full of beautifully wrapped gifts. The backyard was already crowded with at least 30 people: aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, family, friends. The smell of grilling meat filled the air, and children ran laughing across the lawn. It looked like the perfect family gathering, the kind I had always dreamed of being welcomed into. I walked through the gate with a smile on my face and hope in my heart, completely unaware that I was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Brenda spotted me immediately and moved through the crowd toward me with purpose in her step. I thought she was coming to welcome me, to hug me, to show everyone that her oldest daughter had finally come home. Instead, she stopped about 5 feet away from me and raised her voice loud enough for every single person in that backyard to hear. What happened next is something I will never forget as long as I live. Brenda accused me, in front of everyone, of manipulating a dying old woman for money. She called me a vulture who had swooped in on Grandmother Edith in her final days to coerce her into changing her will. She said I had used my legal expertise to confuse and control a vulnerable elderly woman who did not know what she was signing. Tiffany stepped forward with her phone held high, showing the photographs of the will she had stolen from Grandmother Edith's files. She scrolled through the images while Brenda narrated, pointing out the percentages and dollar amounts with theatrical outrage. The crowd gasped and murmured, I saw relatives I had known my entire life looking at me with disgust and disappointment. I tried to speak, tried to explain that grandmother Edith had made her own choices, and that I had nothing to do with drafting the will. But Brenda talked over me. She called me a greedy, heartless vulture, who had abandoned my family for money and career. She said I only visited my grandmother to secure my inheritance, that I had never loved anyone but myself. Derek stood silently beside his mother, refusing to meet my eyes, refusing to defend me even though he knew the truth. Aunt Lorraine shook her head slowly, her face arranged in an expression of profound disappointment, playing her role of shocked supporter perfectly. The gifts I had brought with such hope fell from my arms as I backed away from the crowd. My carefully styled hair fell into my face as tears streamed down my cheeks. I turned and ran to my car while 30 people watched me flee in shame. I could hear Brenda's voice behind me, still performing for her audience, still painting me as the villain, in a drama she had written specifically to destroy me. I drove home in a daze, barely able to see the road through my tears. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed on my bed and cried until I had nothing left. I seriously considered giving up the inheritance, signing over everything to Brenda and Derek if that was what it would take to restore peace in my family. That night, I came as close as I had ever come to simply surrendering to the people who were determined to break me. I did not know then that this public humiliation was only the beginning, that Brenda had much bigger plans for my destruction. 2.5 months before the confrontation in my office, my mother escalated her campaign from public humiliation to professional destruction. She filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association, alleging that I had engaged in undue influence over a vulnerable elderly client. The complaint was detailed and devastating, accusing me of using my legal expertise to manipulate grandmother Edith into leaving me the majority of her estate. It claimed I had positioned myself as her trusted advisor specifically to enrich myself, that I had isolated her from other family members, and that I had taken advantage of her declining mental capacity to coerce changes to her will. The complaint called for my law license to be suspended pending a full investigation, and for criminal charges to be considered if the allegations were proven true. My entire career, everything I had sacrificed to build over more than a decade of brutal work, was suddenly at risk because of lies told by my own mother. Raymond Hartley called me into his office the day after the complaint was filed. He was 65 years old and had been a senior partner at the firm for over 30 years. He had mentored me since my first day as a junior associate, and had always believed in my potential. When I walked into his office, I could see the conflict on his face. He told me he had reviewed the complaint, and that he personally did not believe a word of it. He knew my character, knew my work ethic, knew that I would never do the things Brenda had accused me of doing. But the firm had a reputation to protect, and they could not afford to be associated with a scandal involving elder abuse and estate manipulation. He told me I was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. He said it was not a punishment, just a precaution, but we both knew what it meant. Word spread through the office within hours. Colleagues who had greeted me warmly every morning suddenly avoided eye contact in the hallways. People whispered behind closed doors when I walked past. Rumors began circulating that I was about to be arrested, that I had stolen millions from old people, that I was not the person everyone thought I was. My professional reputation was being destroyed one conversation at a time. But Brenda was not satisfied with attacking my career through official channels. She enlisted Tiffany to wage a parallel war in the court of public opinion. Tiffany created anonymous social media accounts and began posting fabricated stories about my alleged misconduct. She claimed to have inside knowledge of other elderly clients I had supposedly exploited. She contacted legal blogs and news websites with tips about the up-and-coming attorney who preyed on vulnerable seniors. She even reached out to some of my former clients, trying to convince them that I had stolen from them without their knowledge. Most of my clients knew better, but the accusations spread anyway, polluting my name across the internet. Every time I searched for myself online, I found new lies waiting to ambush me. My professional reputation, built painstakingly over more than 10 years, was being shredded by someone who had known me for barely 3 years and had hated me from the first moment we met. I retreated to my apartment and did not emerge for 3 full days. I stopped eating, barely slept, and spent hours staring at the ceiling wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. I drafted a resignation letter to the firm, deciding it would be easier to walk away than to fight. I considered calling Brenda and offering to sign over my entire inheritance if she would just make the nightmare stop. I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life, surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of family members, abandoned by a professional community I had devoted myself to serving. The woman who had survived poverty, worked multiple jobs through college, fought her way into a prestigious law firm through sheer determination and talent, was ready to give up. I was ready to let them win because I no longer had the strength to fight. On the fourth day, Corinne Mitchell used the spare key I had given her for emergencies and let herself into my apartment. She found me in bed, unwashed, surrounded by empty water bottles and tissues. She took one look at me and started talking in a voice that left no room for argument. She said this was exactly what they wanted, that Brenda and Tiffany and Derek were probably celebrating right now because they had broken me so easily. She asked if I was really going to let the people who had treated me like garbage my entire life win this easily. She reminded me that I was a brilliant attorney who had never lost an important case, that I had fought my way up from nothing while Derek had been handed everything and still failed at life. She told me to get up, take a shower, and start fighting back. Corinne stayed with me for 6 hours that day, forcing me to eat, helping me organize my thoughts, and devising a plan to clear my name. By the time she left, something had shifted inside me. The despair had not disappeared, but it had made room for something else. Anger. Clean, focused, righteous anger. I was done being a victim. It was time to show my family exactly who they were dealing with. 2 months before the confrontation in my office, I transformed from a passive victim into an active fighter. The first step was hiring Jasper Donovan, a private investigator who came highly recommended by one of my former clients. Jasper was 42 years old, former FBI, with a reputation for finding information that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. I told him everything about my family situation, about the will, about the BBQ, about the bar complaint. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook. When I finished, he looked at me with something like admiration and said he had rarely seen such a coordinated campaign of destruction. He took my case immediately and promised to have initial findings within 2 weeks. Jasper's first discoveries confirmed suspicions I had not even allowed myself to fully form. Tiffany Callahan had not always been Tiffany Callahan. Before she met my brother Derek, she was Tamara Jenkins from Phoenix, Arizona. She had changed her name legally about 6 months before moving to Chicago, right around the time she met Derek at a real estate conference. The reason for the name change became clear when Jasper pulled her records from Arizona. Tamara Jenkins had outstanding warrants for check fraud, identity theft, and theft by deception. She had run a scheme targeting elderly homeowners, convincing them to invest in fake property developments and disappearing with their money. She had been arrested twice, but had fled the state before her trial. The woman my brother had married, the woman my mother had welcomed into our family, was a professional con artist who had specifically targeted Derek because of our family's wealth potential. Suddenly, Tiffany's enthusiasm for helping with grandmother Edith's care took on a much more sinister meaning. While Jasper continued his investigation, grandmother Edith's condition worsened significantly. Her doctors moved her from her home to a private room at Chicago Memorial Hospital for round-the-clock care. I rushed to the hospital the moment I heard, desperate to be with her during what we all knew were her final days. But when I arrived at her floor and tried to enter her room, a security guard stopped me. He apologized but said he could not allow me access. When I demanded to know why, he explained that the patient's family contact had restricted visitor access. I asked to see the visitor list, and my name was not on it. My mother Brenda had somehow gotten herself listed as grandmother Edith's sole family contact, and she had specifically excluded me from the approved visitor list. I stood in that hospital hallway and felt a rage I had never experienced before. My grandmother was dying, possibly had only days left to live, and my own mother was preventing me from saying goodbye. Every instinct told me to cause a scene, to push past the security guard, and fight my way to my grandmother's bedside. But I was an attorney, and I knew that emotional outbursts would only make my situation worse. Instead, I left the hospital calmly and drove directly to my office. I still had access to the legal databases despite my administrative leave, and I used them to research my options. Then I filed an emergency petition with the hospital administration, demanding access to my grandmother based on legal documents they did not know existed. You see, 3 years earlier, grandmother Edith had signed a healthcare power of attorney naming me as her designated healthcare agent. She had done this specifically because she did not trust Brenda to make medical decisions for her. The document had been properly executed and notarized, and I had kept a copy in my safe deposit box. Brenda had hidden the original document, never imagining I would have a duplicate. Within 4 hours of filing my petition, the hospital administration overturned Brenda's restrictions, and I was allowed into my grandmother's room. I spent 2 precious hours with Grandmother Edith that evening. She was weak and tired, drifting in and out of sleep, but she recognized me the moment I took her hand. She smiled, and said she knew I would find a way. We talked quietly about memories, about love, about the life she had lived and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Then she told me something that would change everything. She said she had video recordings, evidence of things Brenda and Tiffany had said and done during their visits over the past few months. Grandmother Edith had been recording conversations on her tablet without anyone knowing, building a case against her own daughter because she knew I would need protection after she was gone. The recordings were stored on a USB drive in her safety deposit box at First National Bank. She reached under her pillow and pressed a small key into my palm. She made me promise to use the recordings when the time was right, to protect myself and to make sure justice was served. I promised her I would. I held her hand and told her I loved her, and thanked her for always believing in me. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 6 weeks before the confrontation in my office, Jasper Donovan walked into my apartment with a folder full of evidence that shattered my remaining illusions about my family. He had obtained phone records for Aunt Lorraine through legal channels I chose not to question, and the records told a devastating story. Lorraine had been making daily phone calls to Brenda, often immediately after speaking with me. The timestamps aligned perfectly with our conversations over the past 2 years. Every time I had shared something personal with my aunt, believing she was my ally and confidant, she had immediately reported back to my mother. Jasper had also recovered text messages from a discarded phone he had purchased from a recycling center. The messages between Lorraine and Brenda were explicit in their betrayal. Lorraine provided detailed summaries of my emotional state, my plans, my fears. She reported when I seemed vulnerable, when I seemed strong, what strategies might be most effective at undermining me, and she had been paid for this service. Bank records showed that Brenda had transferred over $20,000 to Lorraine over the past 2 years. Always in amounts, just under the reporting threshold, always disguised as birthday gifts or holiday presents. The discovery of Lorraine's betrayal hit me harder than almost anything else. I had genuinely loved my aunt and believed she loved me. I had trusted her with my most private thoughts and feelings, things I had never shared with anyone else. Learning that she had sold me out for money, that every sympathetic word she had ever spoken was a performance designed to extract information, made me question whether anyone in my family had ever truly cared about me at all. Jasper tried to comfort me by pointing out that her betrayal proved I was a threat to them, that they would not have invested so much time and money in monitoring me if I was as worthless as they tried to make me believe. It was cold comfort, but it was something. Just days after discovering Lorraine's betrayal, she called me with what she presented as wonderful news. She claimed she had finally decided to stand up to Brenda on my behalf. She said she had evidence that my mother had fabricated the entire bar complaint, that she had forged documents and bribed witnesses. She wanted to meet with me at her house to share the evidence and help me clear my name. A month earlier, I would have rushed to meet her, desperate for any family ally, but now I knew better. I told Jasper about the invitation, and he immediately began investigating. What he discovered was chilling. Lorraine had purchased recording equipment the previous week. She had also been in contact with a lawyer who specialized in defamation cases, specifically cases where recorded statements could be used against the speaker. The plan was clear. Lorraine would lead me into making statements that could be taken out of context, recordings that Brenda could use to strengthen her bar complaint, or file additional charges against me. My own aunt had been willing to help entrap me in my final destruction. I declined Lorraine's invitation, and never told her why. Let her wonder how I had found out. Let her fear what else I might know. 3 days after I refused Lorraine's trap, Grandmother Edith died. I was holding her hand when she took her final breath, just as she had wanted. Her last words, spoken in a whisper I had to lean close to hear, were, "Make them pay for what they did to you. No mercy." I held her for a long time after she was gone, crying quietly, saying goodbye to the only person in my family who had ever truly loved me. Then the door opened, and Brenda swept in with Harold trailing behind her. My mother immediately began performing grief, wailing and throwing herself across Grandmother Edith's body, as if she had been a devoted daughter rather than someone who had visited only to scheme and manipulate. She shouted at the nurses, demanding to know why she had not been called sooner, why she had been denied the chance to say goodbye to her own mother. She turned to me with venom in her eyes, and accused me of keeping her from her dying mother's bedside. She told the hospital staff that I had somehow blocked her access, that I had manipulated the system to exclude my own family from their grandmother's final moments. The nurses looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I left the hospital without a word, knowing that anything I said would only fuel Brenda's performance. Brenda seized control of the funeral arrangements before Grandmother Edith's body was even cold. She positioned herself as the grieving daughter, the one who should make all decisions about how her mother would be memorialized. I was not consulted about the service, the flowers, the readings, or the guest list. I learned about the funeral details from a generic announcement posted on the funeral home's website. When I arrived at the service, dressed in black, carrying a small bouquet of Grandmother Edith's favorite flowers, security guards stopped me at the entrance. They said my name was not on the approved guest list, and that the family had specifically requested I not be admitted. I stood there in shock, unable to believe what was happening. Other guests arriving for the funeral walked past me, staring and whispering. Many of them had been at the BBQ where Brenda had publicly accused me of exploitation. Now they saw me being turned away from my own grandmother's funeral, and they probably thought I deserved it. I could have made a scene. I could have screamed and cried and forced my way inside, but I knew that was exactly what Brenda wanted. She wanted me to behave badly so she could point to it as evidence of my instability and greed. Instead, I walked to my car and sat in the parking lot, watching through the window, as family members I had known my entire life filed into the funeral home to say goodbye to a woman who had loved me more than any of them. I saw Derek help Brenda up the steps, playing the devoted son. I saw Tiffany dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, performing sadness she had never felt. I saw Lorraine put her arm around Brenda, in a gesture of sisterly support, two traitors comforting each other. The local newspaper had sent a photographer, probably tipped off by Tiffany, and the next day there was a story about the family dispute that had marred a prominent local businesswoman's funeral. My name was mentioned, along with allegations of estate manipulation. My professional reputation, already damaged, took another devastating hit. I sat in that parking lot for 2 hours, watching mourners come and go, unable to leave, unable to enter. I thought about giving up, not just on the inheritance, not just on my career, but on everything. I imagined getting in my car and driving until I ran out of gas, starting over somewhere no one knew my name, becoming someone else entirely. I was so tired of fighting people who were supposed to love me. I was so tired of being the villain in a story I had never agreed to participate in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost ignored it. But something made me look. It was Corinne, texting me the words that would pull me back from the edge. She wrote, "We found something big in the safety deposit box. Call me immediately." Grandmother Edith had kept her promise. Even in death, she was still protecting me. 4 weeks before the confrontation in my office, I finally opened my grandmother's safety deposit box and discovered the weapons she had left me. The USB drive contained dozens of video recordings made over the past 6 months, captured secretly on a tablet Grandmother Edith had positioned to look like a decorative picture frame. The recordings were devastating. There was video of Brenda admitting that she had never really loved me, calling me a mistake that had ruined her life. There was footage of Tiffany discussing her plans to get rid of Meredith by any means necessary, laughing about how easy it would be to destroy someone so desperate for family approval. There were recordings of Brenda and Tiffany reviewing the will photographs and plotting their response, explicitly stating that they knew Grandmother Edith was mentally competent and had made her own decisions. The bar complaint allegations were lies, and now I had proof. But the videos were just the beginning. The safety deposit box also contained documents that proved Brenda had been stealing from Grandmother Edith for years. Bank statements showed unauthorized transfers totaling over $200,000. Money Brenda had taken without permission and spent on luxury vacations, designer clothes, and a new kitchen renovation. There were forged signatures on checks, clumsy forgeries that any handwriting expert could identify. Grandmother Edith had documented everything meticulously, building a case against her own daughter, knowing that someday the evidence would be needed. Finally, there was a second will, more recent than the one Tiffany had photographed, signed just 3 weeks before Grandmother Edith's death. This will left me 80% of the estate, instead of 70, with a detailed explanation of why Brenda's share had been reduced. Grandmother Edith wrote that she had discovered her daughter's theft and could not in good conscience reward such betrayal. The second will was ironclad, properly witnessed, and notarized by Theodore Prescott himself. I brought everything to Raymond Hartley the next morning. He reviewed the evidence for 3 hours without saying a word, watching videos, examining documents, taking detailed notes. When he finally looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. He apologized for ever doubting me, even for a moment. He immediately ordered my reinstatement at the firm, and began drafting motions to dismiss the bar complaint with prejudice. He offered the full resources of Morrison and Hartley to pursue justice against everyone who had tried to destroy me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was not fighting alone. With Raymond's help, I launched my counterattack on multiple fronts. I filed fraud charges against Tiffany based on her Arizona warrants, providing information to law enforcement that led to her immediate arrest warrant. I reported Brenda's elder abuse and financial exploitation to the appropriate authorities, providing them with the documentary evidence grandmother Edith had gathered. I filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with inheritance rights. I sent cease and desist letters to Lorraine and every website that had published false information about me. I froze all estate assets pending the investigation into Brenda's theft, meaning she could not touch a penny of grandmother Edith's money until the courts determined what she had stolen. Within a week, the people who had spent months trying to destroy me were suddenly scrambling to defend themselves. Derek discovered the truth about his wife in the worst possible way. Police officers showed up at his door with questions about Tiffany's past as Tamara Jenkins. They explained the fraud charges, the outstanding warrants, the victims she had left behind in Arizona. Derek confronted Tiffany that night, and she finally admitted everything. She told him she had married him specifically because of his family's wealth potential, that she had never loved him, that she had been working with Brenda from the beginning to ensure the inheritance went to them instead of me. She revealed text messages between herself and our mother that proved they had coordinated every attack against me, from the BBQ humiliation to the bar complaint to the social media campaign. Derek was devastated. His wife was a con artist, his mother was a criminal, and his sister was innocent of everything she had been accused of. For the first time in his life, Derek had to choose between the easy path of continued denial and the hard path of facing the truth. He chose the truth. Derek made secret copies of everything on Tiffany's phone before she could delete it. He gathered evidence of his mother's schemes, recording conversations where Brenda discussed her plans to have me committed to a psychiatric facility if the bar complaint did not work. He documented everything he could find about the theft from grandmother Edith and the fabricated allegations against me. Then he made a decision that would change everything. He decided to help me. Derek reached out through a message to my work email, knowing that Tiffany monitored his personal accounts. He wrote only 6 words. I know everything. I am sorry. The morning of the confrontation began with Derek's cryptic text message. Don't come to the BBQ. Trust me. I stared at my phone for a long time, trying to understand what he meant. I had not been invited to any BBQ. After the disaster 3 months earlier, I had assumed I would never be welcome at a family gathering again. I called Corinne, who did some quick research and discovered that Brenda had organized another party, this one, ostensibly a celebration of grandmother Edith's life. But Corinne's sources, cultivated carefully over the past weeks, revealed the true purpose. Brenda had hired 3 people to claim I had threatened them. She had planned to have me arrested for harassment and intimidation the moment I arrived, creating a public spectacle that would destroy what remained of my reputation and potentially land me in jail. Derek's warning had saved me from walking into another trap. 2 hours later, Derek and Tiffany walked into my office without an appointment. My assistant Gloria tried to stop them, but I waved her off. I needed to hear what they had to say. Tiffany looked like she had not slept in days. Her usually perfect makeup was smeared, her designer clothes were wrinkled, and her hands trembled as she clutched a stack of documents. Derek looked even worse, his face gray and aged, the golden child finally forced to confront the ugliness he had spent his life ignoring. He spoke first, the words tumbling out like he was afraid he would lose his courage if he slowed down. He told me they were trying to destroy me, that everything I suspected and more was true. He said they had made a terrible mistake, that he had made a terrible mistake, and he was there to fix it. Before he could continue, I noticed movement in the hallway behind them. 2 police officers were approaching my office, and for one terrible moment I thought Brenda's trap had found me anyway, but the officers were not there for me. They walked past Derek, ignored me entirely, and approached Tiffany. One of them asked if she was Tamara Jenkins, also known as Tiffany Callahan. When she nodded, her face crumbling, they informed her that she was under arrest for fraud, identity theft, and failure to appear in the state of Arizona. They read her rights as they handcuffed her, and she began to sob. Before they led her away, she turned to Derek with hatred in her eyes and screamed that he would regret this, that his mother would destroy him too now that he had betrayed them. The officers escorted her out, and the door closed behind them, leaving me alone with my brother for the first time in months. Derek's confession took over an hour. He played recordings from Tiffany's phone, evidence he had gathered over the past 2 weeks. I heard my mother discussing plans to have me committed to a psychiatric facility, claiming I was mentally unstable and a danger to myself. I heard her admitting to forging documents and bribing a notary to backdoor witness statements. I heard Tiffany laughing about how she had manipulated Derek into proposing, boasting about the fortune she planned to steal from our family. I heard Lorraine discussing her payments for spying, negotiating for a larger share of the inheritance in exchange for her continued loyalty. Every word confirmed what I had suspected, and every word broke my heart a little more. This was my family. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. When the recordings ended, Derek broke down completely. He sobbed like a child, apologizing for every time he had stood silently while Brenda attacked me, for every dollar I had given him that he never thanked me for every moment he had chosen the easy path over the right one. He said he had always known, somewhere deep inside, that our mother's treatment of me was wrong. But he was weak and scared and selfish, and it was easier to pretend he did not see it than to risk losing her favor. He begged for my forgiveness and offered to testify against Brenda in every legal proceeding. He would tell the truth about everything, no matter the consequences to himself. I sat in silence for a long time after he finished speaking. The emotions swirling inside me were too complex to untangle. Anger at decades of betrayal, grief for the family I had never really had, unexpected compassion for my brother's weakness, because I understood what it was like to spend your whole life seeking Brenda's approval. I did not forgive him. Not then, maybe not ever. Some wounds are too deep to heal with a single apology. But I accepted his help. I told him that actions would matter more than words going forward, and if he truly wanted to make things right, he would need to prove it. He nodded, wiped his eyes, and said he understood. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. 6 months after that confrontation in my office, justice had finally been served. The legal consequences for those who had tried to destroy me were severe and satisfying. Brenda was convicted of elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation. The evidence grandmother Edith had gathered, combined with Derek's testimony and the recordings from Tiffany's phone, created an overwhelming case. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to repay every dollar she had stolen from her own mother. I was there when they led her away in handcuffs, and she screamed at me the entire time, calling me names, blaming me for everything, refusing to accept any responsibility for her own actions. Even in defeat, she could not acknowledge what she had done wrong. Lorraine was charged as an accessory to fraud and defamation. Her role in the scheme, accepting payment to spy on me and participating in the attempt to entrap me, earned her 3 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. She was also required to pay damages for her part in the defamation campaign. She never apologized, never admitted she had done anything wrong. At her sentencing, she claimed she had been manipulated by Brenda, that she was a victim too. The judge was unimpressed. Tiffany faced charges in multiple states for her long history of fraud. The Arizona warrants were just the beginning. As investigators dug into her past, they discovered victims across 4 states, elderly people she had deceived and stolen from before moving on to her next mark. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, with additional state charges pending. Derek filed for divorce while she was awaiting trial, and she signed the papers without contest. She had nothing left to fight for. The bar complaint against me was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. The State Bar Association issued a formal apology for the distress their investigation had caused, acknowledging that the complaint had been based entirely on fabricated evidence. Morrison and Hartley promoted me to full partner, the position I had been working toward for over a decade. My reputation, so badly damaged by the lies and accusations, gradually recovered as the truth became public. The same legal blogs that had published false stories about me now ran retractions and profiles celebrating my vindication. Grandmother Edith's estate was settled according to her final wishes. I inherited 80%, just as she had intended. I used a substantial portion of the money to establish the Edith Callahan Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing elder abuse and supporting victims of financial exploitation. It seemed like the perfect way to honor her memory, using the wealth she had built to protect others from the kind of predators she had faced within her own family. I also made sure my father Harold was provided for, despite his decades of silence and passivity. He was 75 years old and had nowhere to go now that Brenda was in prison. I bought him a small house near the lake where he had always wanted to retire, and I set up a trust to cover his expenses for the rest of his life. He did not deserve my generosity, but Grandmother Edith would have wanted him cared for. Harold surprised me in the months after Brenda's conviction. Without his wife's dominating presence, a different man began to emerge. He called me one Sunday afternoon, the first time he had ever called me directly, and asked if we could meet. We had coffee at a small diner halfway between our homes, and he spoke more words to me in that hour than he had in the previous 30 years combined. He apologized for being a coward. He apologized for letting Brenda treat me so badly for so long. He explained, not to excuse himself but to help me understand, that he had been afraid of her from the day they married. She had made him feel worthless and powerless, the same way she had made me feel, and he had coped by withdrawing and pretending not to see. He started therapy to understand his passivity, to become the father he should have been all along. Our relationship will never be what it could have been if he had stood up for me decades ago. But we have something now, a tentative connection built on honesty instead of pretense. It is more than I ever expected to have. Derek also worked to rebuild himself. He got his first real job at 30 years old, an entry-level position at a construction company where no one knew his family or cared about his past. He went to therapy to understand his codependency and his desperate need for Brenda's approval. He stopped asking me for money and started paying his own way for the first time in his life. Our relationship is complicated, and probably always will be. We have monthly dinners where we talk carefully around the subjects that still hurt. We are not close, but we are cordial. I shared some of my inheritance with him, not because he deserved it, but because Grandmother Edith would have wanted her grandchildren provided for, and because holding on to anger was exhausting me. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment, and I am still working through it. My own healing journey took me places I never expected to go. I took a 3-month sabbatical from work, the first real vacation of my adult life. I traveled to places Grandmother Edith had always wanted to visit: Paris, where she had dreamed of studying art as a young woman; Rome, where she had planned to celebrate her 50th wedding anniversary before my grandfather died; Tokyo, where she had been fascinated by the blend of ancient tradition and modern innovation. At each location, I felt her presence with me, guiding me toward experiences that enriched my soul. I visited her grave when I returned, kneeling on the grass beside her headstone and telling her everything that had happened. I thanked her for the courage she had given me, for believing in me when no one else did, for protecting me even from beyond the grave. When I returned to Chicago, I found that my life had expanded in ways I had never imagined possible. Corinne, who had saved me from despair more times than I could count, became even more central to my world. I realized that the family I had been desperately seeking approval from had never been my real family. My real family was the people who showed up for me when everything fell apart. Corinne, who broke into my apartment to pull me out of my depression; Raymond, who believed in me when the evidence seemed damning; even the colleagues who quietly supported me during my administrative leave. I started building a chosen family, people connected by love and loyalty rather than blood and obligation. I began dating for the first time in years, allowing myself to be vulnerable with someone who saw me clearly and wanted me anyway. I stopped defining myself by my family's opinion of me and started defining myself by my own values and achievements. On the first anniversary of Grandmother Edith's death, I drove to the cemetery alone. I brought a bouquet of her favorite flowers and a letter I had written telling her everything I wished I could say in person. I sat beside her grave for over an hour, sometimes talking aloud, sometimes just sitting in peaceful silence. I told her about the foundation bearing her name, about the lives it was already changing. I told her about my father's tentative steps toward becoming a real parent. I told her about Derek's slow transformation from golden child to actual adult. I told her I had finally learned the lesson she had been trying to teach me my whole life: that my worth was not determined by the people who refused to see it. The real inheritance Grandmother Edith left me was not the money, though that certainly helped. It was permission to stop seeking love from people incapable of giving it. It was the courage to fight for myself when everything seemed hopeless. It was the understanding that forgiveness does not mean reconciliation, that you can release anger and resentment without welcoming your abusers back into your life. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the most toxic forces you will ever encounter, and sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from them forever. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from Brenda in prison. It was the 4th one she had sent since her conviction. Like the others, I did not open it. I placed it in a drawer with the rest, unopened, unread. Maybe someday I will be ready to read what she has to say. Maybe someday I will have healed enough to hear her words without being wounded by them. Or maybe those letters will stay sealed forever, relics of a relationship that was never what it should have been. Either way, I am at peace. I no longer need her approval, her love, or her acknowledgement. I have found all of those things within myself and in the people who truly care about me. If you are watching this, and you come from a family that hurts you, I want you to know that you are not alone. I want you to know that their inability to love you properly says everything about them and nothing about you. I want you to know that it is possible to break free from toxic family dynamics, to build a life full of people who appreciate and support you, to find happiness that does not depend on the approval of people who have proven they cannot be trusted with your heart. It will not be easy. The road to healing is long and painful and full of setbacks, but it is worth every difficult step. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut ties with family members who were hurting you? How did you find the strength to walk away? Drop your stories in the comments below. If this story touched you, or helped you feel less alone in your struggles, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories of survival and triumph. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Someone who might be trapped in a toxic family situation and needs to know that escape is possible. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this community. I hope you find the peace and happiness you deserve, and I hope you never forget that your worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.